Stop scrolling, because what you're about to hear is either the most delayed confession in reality TV history, or the messiest rewrite of the truth we've seen all year. After years of silence, side-eye interviews, and carefully worded statements, Marc Daly has finally decided to talk, and let's just say, this is not the fairy tale ending anyone was promised. Why now? Why this version of the story? And why does it sound less like a divorce announcement and more like a late-night emotional expose disguised as closure? Marc isn't just breaking his silence, he's cracking the entire narrative wide open. According to him, the marriage to Kenya Moore didn't collapse overnight. Oh no? He claims it was never solid to begin with. And here's where things get spicy. Marc suggests that while cameras were rolling and smiles were curated, power dynamics were shifting, identities were shrinking, and someone else's shadow loomed a little too large. Coincidence? Or carefully hidden truth? The internet is already spiraling. Old clips are resurfacing. Fans are picking sides. Comment sections are turning into courtrooms. And Kenya, silent. Completely silent. So the question is, are we finally hearing the truth? Or just the loudest version of one man's regret? Buckle up. This gets uncomfortable fast. What makes this story so explosive isn't just that Marc Daly is suddenly talking, it's how he's talking. Because according to him, this was never a marriage built on love, partnership, or even mutual respect. He claims it was a performance from day one. A brand, a storyline, a carefully packaged image designed for cameras, headlines, and applause, while behind closed doors, something very different was happening. And Marc says he played along longer than he should have until playing along started to erase him completely. Let's rewind because context matters here. Marc Daly wasn't introduced to the public as some thirsty hanger-on. He was presented as the successful restaurateur, the grounded businessman, the man who tamed Kenya Moore. That was the narrative. The calm to her storm. The mystery man who didn't need the spotlight. But Marc now claims that image worked against him from the very beginning. He says the public never saw a husband, they saw a prop. Someone positioned just off-center, useful for optics, but disposable when inconvenient, and here's where the tension starts to build. Marc alleges that even before the wedding, there were warning signs he ignored. Long stretches of emotional distance. Conversations that felt rehearsed instead of real. Moments where decisions about their life were made without him even being in the room. He says it was subtle at first, the kind of thing you brush off because you don't want to look insecure. But over time, those small moments stacked up into something heavier, something colder. He claims that power was always the unspoken third person in the marriage. Not money exactly, not fame alone, but control of the narrative. Who gets to speak? Who gets believed? Who gets protected? According to Marc, whenever conflict came up, it wasn't about resolving it. It was about managing perception. What would the audience think? How would this look on camera? What storyline could survive another season? And Marc says every time those questions came first, the marriage came last. People online love to point to old clips now. Moments that once looked playful or awkward, but suddenly feel loaded with tension. The interviews where Kenya spoke around Marc instead of with him. The scenes where he appeared distant, guarded, almost uncomfortable. At the time, viewers called him controlling, dismissive, emotionally unavailable. Marc says that label became a shield that allowed everything else to go unquestioned. Because once the internet decided who the villain was, no one asked why he looked so exhausted trying to keep up. And then there's the claim that really sent comment sections into meltdown. Marc suggests that Kenya's emotional investment was never fully in the marriage. He doesn't accuse her outright of cheating in the traditional sense, no hotel receipts, no blurry photos, but he describes something he says hurt even more. Emotional loyalty that belonged somewhere else. A connection that predated the wedding and quietly survived it. He claims there was another presence in the background. Someone whose opinion mattered more than his. Someone whose approval carried weight he never could compete with. He describes sitting in rooms where he felt invisible, where conversations shifted when he entered, where decisions were already made. He says it felt like joining a story already halfway written, where his role was clearly defined and limited. According to him, whenever he tried to assert himself, it was framed as insecurity. Whenever he asked for boundaries, it was labeled control. And slowly, the line between compromise and self-erasure blurred. What really shook people was Marc's description of loneliness inside the marriage. Not the dramatic shouting matches people expect, but long stretches of silence. Emotional absenteeism. He claims there were days when he felt more like a handler than a husband, managing schedules, appearances, and expectations instead of building a life. He says intimacy turned into obligation, communication into negotiation, and love into something conditional on compliance. Critics are already rolling their eyes, of course. They point out his own behavior, his reluctance to film, his sharp tone in certain scenes. They argue that this sounds like revisionist history from a man trying to save face. But supporters say something else entirely, that this sounds like someone who finally stopped protecting an image that never protected him back. And that's where the narrative gets complicated, because two things can be true at once. Someone can be flawed and still hurt. Someone can be disliked and still silenced. Marc claims the breaking point didn't come with a single explosive fight, but with a realization. He says he looked at his life and didn't recognize himself anymore. His voice had softened to avoid conflict. His opinions were filtered to avoid backlash. His presence felt optional. And the scariest part, according to him, was how normal that started to feel. How easy it was to justify staying quiet for the sake of peace, for the sake of image, for the sake of a marriage that already felt like a ghost. He says when the cracks finally became visible to the public, the marriage had already been over for a long time. What viewers witnessed, he claims, was not a breakdown, but a delayed acknowledgement, a slow unraveling that cameras could no longer edit around. And when the divorce papers finally entered the picture, Marc says they were just paperwork catching up to an emotional reality that had expired years earlier. Now, the internet is doing what it does best: replaying, reanalyzing, reframing. Moments once dismissed as awkward are being labeled warning signs. Silence is being interpreted as strategy. Every past interview is suddenly a clue. And Keena's refusal to engage publicly only adds fuel to the speculation. Is she choosing dignity? Legal caution? Or does she simply not see this story the way Marc does at all? What makes this even more unsettling is Marc's insistence that he stayed quiet, not because he had nothing to say, but because he knew what would happen if he did. He says he understood how narratives work, how easily one voice can be drowned out when it doesn't align with the established storyline. And he claims it wasn't until the marriage was completely behind him that he felt free enough to speak, even knowing the backlash would be brutal, and just when it seems like this is simply a story about a failed celebrity marriage. Marc hints at something deeper, something involving behind-the-scenes pressure, image management, and unspoken rules that governed every move. Rules that didn't come from the relationship itself, but from the world surrounding it. A world where authenticity is optional and silence is often the price of survival. And as those rules started to close in tighter and tighter, Marc says he realized the marriage wasn't just ending. It had already been replaced by something else entirely. Something that demanded loyalty without intimacy, visibility without voice, and a level of compliance he could no longer maintain as the story moves forward into what he claims happened next. According to Marc, is where things stop looking like a private marital breakdown and start feeling like a carefully managed operation. He claims the moment he emotionally checked out, the machinery around the relationship shifted into overdrive. Suddenly, conversations weren't about feelings anymore. They were about optics, timing, damage control. What could be said, what absolutely could not? And most importantly, who would be blamed when the story finally broke? Marc alleges that there were off-camera discussions that never made it to viewers. Conversations framed as protecting the brand rather than addressing the marriage. He says there was an unspoken understanding that the narrative needed a villain, and he fit the role conveniently well. The quiet husband, the distant partner, the man who didn't want to film. According to him, that characterization wasn't accidental, it was useful. Because once that image stuck, every concern he raised could be dismissed as attitude, ego, or insecurity, and this is where anonymous sources supposedly come into play. Alleged insiders claim Marc wasn't just emotionally sidelined, he was strategically excluded. Events he wasn't informed about, meetings he wasn't invited to, decisions made about their shared life that he found out about the same way the public did online. These sources describe a dynamic where Marc's presence was optional unless it served a specific purpose. Appear for this. Smile here. Stay quiet there. Smile here. Stay quiet there. One source claims there was a running joke among people close to the situation that Marc was the husband on paper. Another alleges that he was warned, subtly but repeatedly, not to disrupt the storyline, that if he wanted peace, he needed to understand how the system worked. Whether those claims are exaggerated or not, they've set the internet on fire because suddenly people are looking back at old footage with new eyes. That dinner scene, that reunion exchange, that moment of silence that felt awkward at the time but now feels loaded. Marc also claims money became another pressure point, not because of a lack of it, but because of how it was used. He alleges there was lavish spending that symbolized independence rather than partnership. Big gestures made publicly, while private discussions about shared priorities never happened. According to him, finances were less about building a future together and more about reinforcing who held leverage. And whenever he questioned it, the conversation shifted to gratitude, to how lucky he was, to how easily he could be replaced in the public narrative. Public reaction, of course, was ruthless. As whispers of trouble grew louder, comment sections turned into battlegrounds. Some accused Marc of living off his wife's fame. Others painted him as emotionally abusive, citing clipped scenes and sound bites as evidence. Marc says watching that unfold felt surreal. He claims he was being judged for a version of himself that existed almost entirely on screen, a caricature shaped by editing, timing, and assumption. And he insists that once that caricature stuck, correcting it became impossible. Then there's the alleged emotional third rail, the connection Marc says never disappeared. He doesn't frame it as a traditional affair, but he describes it as a constant emotional presence that influenced decisions, validated feelings, and subtly undermined the marriage. According to Marc, this person's approval carried weight in moments where his own concerns were brushed aside. He claims that whenever conflict rose between him and Kenya, this outside influence somehow always aligned against him, reinforcing the idea that he was the problem. Fake leaked messages circulating online, screenshots no one can fully verify, have only intensified the speculation. They hint at late-night calls, shared frustrations, emotional venting that crossed boundaries. Are they real? Impossible to confirm. But in the world of viral narratives, confirmation is optional. Suspicion is enough. And Marc knows that. He says once the idea was planted that he was the obstacle rather than the victim, everything that followed was predictable. According to Marc, the emotional toll became physical. Sleepless nights, constant anxiety, the feeling of walking on eggshells in his own marriage. He claims he started withdrawing not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. Because every attempt to assert himself was reframed as aggression, every boundary was interpreted as resistance. And the more he pulled back, the more that withdrawal was used as proof that he didn't care. Insiders claimed there were attempts at mediation that went nowhere. Conversations where Marc expressed feeling erased, only to be told he was being dramatic. Requests for privacy that were labeled secrecy. Efforts to slow things down that were interpreted as control. According to these accounts, the marriage didn't fail because no one tried, it failed because only one version of reality was allowed to exist. As the cracks widened, the audience began sensing something was off. Viewers noticed the lack of warmth, the tension that lingered even in neutral scenes. Some sympathized with Kenya, arguing she deserved more support. Others quietly wondered if Marc was drowning under expectations no one talked about. And when the separation became official, reactions split sharply. celebration from some, vindication from others. Very little curiosity about what actually happened behind closed doors. Marc claims that aftermath was the hardest part, not the divorce itself, but the silence that followed. He says there was an expectation that he would disappear gracefully, accept the narrative, and move on quietly. And for a while, he did. He stayed off social media. He avoided interviews. He let assumptions harden into facts. But according to him, that silence came at a cost. Because every unchallenged rumor chipped away at his sense of self. What changed, he says, was realizing that protecting someone else's image was destroying his own sanity. That staying quiet wasn't noble, it was corrosive. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't to rewrite history, but to explain how it felt to live inside it. To describe a marriage where visibility mattered more than vulnerability, where being present wasn't the same as being valued. Now the fallout is spreading beyond the relationship itself. Online commentators are calling for deeper scrutiny. Was this just a bad match, or an example of how power dynamics distort reality? Were viewers complicit in accepting a simplified story because it was easier to digest? And why does Kenya's continued silence feel louder than any statement she could make? Marc insists he's not asking to be seen as a hero. He admits to mistakes, to moments where he shut down instead of speaking up. But he refuses to accept being painted as a one-dimensional villain. He says the truth, like most truths, is uncomfortable and inconvenient and doesn't fit neatly into a reunion soundbite. And as speculation grows about potential legal disputes, non-disclosure agreements, and behind-the-scenes negotiations, one thing becomes clear: the story isn't cooling down. It's heating up. Because when narratives start unraveling, they rarely stop at the surface. And as more so-called insiders tease that there's still more to come, more context, more receipts, more uncomfortable details, the question shifts from who was right to who controlled the story in the first place. And what happens when that control finally slips? Because according to Marc, the consequences of that shift are only beginning to surface as the situation moves into an even more volatile phase. Marc claims is where everything turns from emotional damage to real-world consequences. Because once silence breaks, it doesn't just release feelings, it invites scrutiny. He suggests that after he stepped away from the marriage and stopped cooperating with the unspoken rules, pressure began showing up in other areas of his life. Business relationships cooled, invitations dried up, conversations that once felt warm suddenly became transactional or disappeared altogether. He says it became clear just how much access, visibility, and opportunity were tied to staying agreeable. According to Marc, there were subtle warnings, not threats, not ultimatums, just reminders. Reminders of how ugly things could get if the narrative shifted too far off course. He claims people he trusted advised him to let it go, to focus on moving forward, which he now interprets as code for don't disrupt what's already been decided. And for a while, fear worked. Fear of being dragged publicly. Fear of being reduced to headlines. Fear of legal complications he didn't have the energy to fight. But Marc says fear eventually gave way to anger, not explosive rage, but a quiet, focused resentment. The kind that builds when you realize your silence has been mistaken for guilt. He claims that watching public opinion harden against him, while knowing how incomplete the story was, became unbearable. Especially as he noticed how easily sympathy flowed in one direction, while his perspective was treated as suspicious by default. That's when talk of consequences shifted from personal to institutional. Online commentators began speculating about contracts, NDA letters, and clauses designed to keep narratives clean. Fake legal experts broke down imaginary agreements in viral threads, suggesting Marc may have been financially incentivized to stay quiet or legally restricted from speaking freely. None of it confirmed, all of it convincing enough to keep the rumor mill spinning. And Marc says that speculation, even when inaccurate, reflects a larger truth: that silence in celebrity relationships is rarely accidental. He also hints at the possibility of financial fallout, not because of divorce settlements alone, but because of lost opportunities. He claims certain doors closed the moment he stopped playing the expected role. Partnership stalled. Project slowed. Suddenly, his name carried baggage that had nothing to do with his work and everything to do with a story he didn't author. And while no official investigations were announced, whispers of audits, reviews, and looking into things circulated just loudly enough to create unease. Public backlash intensified. Some fans doubled down, accusing Marc of bitterness, narcissism, or opportunism. Others began questioning the entire framework they'd accepted for years. Was the audience manipulated by selective storytelling? Were reunion moments designed to provoke rather than clarify? Was silence really dignity or strategy? Every unanswered question became fuel, every old clip a potential smoking gun. Marc claims the emotional toll didn't magically disappear once he spoke. If anything, it got heavier. Because telling your truth doesn't guarantee relief, it guarantees reaction. He describes nights spent replaying interviews, bracing for backlash, wondering if honesty was worth the cost. He admits there were moments he considered retracting everything, going back into the safety of ambiguity. But he says something shifted once the words were out. A sense of reclaiming ownership, even if the price was high. And then there's the looming question of accountability. Marc doesn't suggest criminal behavior or explicit wrongdoing. What he questions is something harder to prosecute: emotional control, narrative dominance, the quiet erosion of autonomy within relationships shaped by power imbalance. He argues that when one person controls the story, the other becomes a footnote, regardless of truth. And he challenges viewers to consider how often they accept simplified villains without asking who benefits from that simplicity. Speculation about future legal action continues to swirl. Will there be tell-all interviews, memoirs, court filings that expose more than intended? Or will everything fade into carefully curated statements and strategic silence? Marc says he doesn't know what comes next, only that he's done pretending the past didn't happen. He insists that whatever consequences come, they're easier to live with than erasing himself to preserve someone else's comfort. Meanwhile, Kenya's silence remains the loudest element in the room. No rebuttal, no clarification, no acknowledgement. Supporters call it class. Critics call it avoidance. Neutral observers call it smart. Marc calls it familiar. He says that throughout the marriage, silence was often used as a weapon, allowing assumptions to do the work without ever getting hands dirty. And watching that same strategy play out publicly feels like déjà vu. As the dust settles, one thing becomes clear. This isn't just about who was right or wrong. It's about how stories are constructed, who gets to tell them, and what happens to the people left out of the edit. Marc isn't asking to be absolved. He's asking to be seen as human, complicated, fallible, hurt, and maybe that's what unsettles people most, that the villain archetype cracked and revealed something messier underneath. The internet will move on eventually. It always does. Another scandal will take its place. Another narrative will demand attention. But for Marc, this wasn't content, it was his life. And he claims that speaking up wasn't about revenge or relevance, but survival. About reclaiming a voice that had been slowly muted under the weight of expectation, image, and fear. So as viewers debate, pick sides, and re-watch old footage with new interpretations, Marc leaves the audience with an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the loudest breakdowns aren't emotional outbursts, they're delayed confessions. And sometimes the real collapse doesn't happen when a marriage ends, but when the story finally stops pretending everything was fine. And there you have it, Marc Daly's side of the story, finally out in the open. But now, the question is yours. Do you believe him? Was this a marriage doomed from the start? Or just a case of public perception gone wrong? Could there be truths we'll never know, hidden behind carefully curated images and silent agreements? The internet is buzzing and fans are picking sides. But what do you think really happened behind closed doors? Did Marc stay silent for too long, or was speaking out finally worth the risk? And what about Kenya Moore? Does her silence speak louder than words ever could? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because this is far from over. hit that like button if you're shocked by what you just heard. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives, viral controversies, and behind-the-scenes breakdowns that mainstream news won't touch. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Because when stories like this unfold, every clip, every leak, and every reaction matters, and you'll want to be here for all of it. The truth is messy, unpredictable, and sometimes devastating, and we'll keep bringing it to you, one shocking revelation at a time.